these issues. So we want to look at China's economic problems and approach them not just from the aspect of what's wrong, but also how's this going to impact the world, and how is that a good thing or is it not? Is it important that we prepare for this situation, and how is it going to affect not only the people in the rest of the world, but also the people within China itself? So I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, Antonio Graceffo, or Graceffo, if you prefer the Italian pronunciation, has spent more than 20 years in Asia, and he earned a PhD at Shanghai University of Sport. He holds a China MBA from Shanghai Jiaotong University, and he studied economics at Shanghai University, as well as national security at the American Military University. Antonio works as an economics professor and a China economic analyst, and he writes for various think tanks and international media. He's published several books. One of his books on China is Beyond the Belt and Road, China's Global Economic Expansion, and a short course on the Chinese economy. You can find him on his website at chinaecongroup.com. Antonio, we'd like to invite you to present your initial thoughts on the economic challenges facing China, and then we will get to the discussion later.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you everyone for joining me today. Well, I'm going to begin by telling you my conclusion, because I don't want you to have to sit there and worry about, well, where's this story going? The story is this: I believe that the Chinese economy is facing serious problems right now. Some of those problems, as Roger mentioned, are systemic. Some of them are probably short to medium term. My long-term prognosis for the Chinese economy is that it is not going to crash. It is not going to collapse. However, the growth will greatly diminish, and China will probably have to just accept about a 3% annual GDP growth rate, if not this year, next year, very soon, that it will just normalize. Some of the points that I'd like to cover today, we sent out the flyer. There were a number of bullet points on there. The first one was FDI. So FDI in China this year is down. When China was doing when China had their economic miracle, when they had their greatest growth, FDI played a tremendous role in growing the Chinese economy very quickly. FDI has a number of purposes. It brings in US dollars, which are needed for foreign currency reserves by the People's Bank of China. Foreign direct investment creates companies, it creates joint ventures, it provides opportunities for technology transfer and for espionage in order for China to obtain technology from abroad. FDI is also very important because 30 to 40% of China's total exports are done by foreign invested companies. So when we see a reduction in FDI in China, we should also see this accompanied by a reduction in exports, which of course is what's happening right now. So when you read in the news that the G7, the group of 7 countries, has decided to de-risk by not decoupling from China, but de-risking from China, what that actually means is, it means that as G7 countries, as the companies from G7 countries contemplate their next investment or the expansion of their factory, that expansion will not happen in China. It will happen in Vietnam or India, or perhaps even be reshored to their home country, into the United States. So that's why we call it de-risking and not decoupling. Decoupling would be that they would close their doors tomorrow and just leave China. And although some companies are doing that, what is more common is that their expansion, their future investments are outside of China. So this is the result of a decrease in FDI. Now, as these companies are not expanding in China, this also means they're not creating jobs. We know that China has this record youth unemployment right now, 21.3%, when Beijing decided that they were no longer going to produce the numbers, they were no longer going to publish the numbers. A point that needs to be addressed here is that labor force participation in China has also dropped. That means the people that have stopped looking for a job, they've just given up. When we add that number labor force participation decline, when we add that to unemployment, it is possible that as much as 40 or 43 or even 45% of young people are jobless. Now, that is absolutely shocking. How can you recover from anything? How can the economy move forward if you have that many young people that are unemployed? Another issue with that is that we have this aging crisis in China. So the aging crisis means that the average age in China is increasing. The number of births per mother is decreasing. You need to have 2.1 births in order to have replacement for the two parents. Obviously, mom and dad have two kids. When mom and dad die, the size of the population remains the same. Last year, we had 1.3 births per mother in China, which means they're no longer at a replacement rate of births. The population declined by about 800,000 people last year. But very important is that people everywhere in the world are living longer. And China has a particularly low retirement age, 55 for women, 60 for men. So we now have an increasing number of retired people in China and a smaller workforce, and the workforce will continue to decline. Now, Europe, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Japan, most of the developed world, with the exception of the United States, hit this aging wall where their population began to either decline or the number of young people was in decline and the workforce was declining. However, those countries were already rich when that happened. In China's case, the average income in China, well, we use GDP per capita as a proxy for the average income. And we say that the average Chinese person has $12,500 of income. Now, that's not exactly correct. As I said, that is the per capita GDP, which is not necessarily exactly the same thing as average wage, but that is the number that we use for comparison. So if we say that the average person is only earning $12,500, well, that is not a first world level of income. When we go to countries like Taiwan, Japan, Europe, even Canada, Hong Kong, that are also facing an aging population, well, the average income is dramatically higher. And of course, the U.S., it's around $75,000 now, so it's dramatically higher. Now, one of the reasons why it's higher is because these countries have moved up the value chain of manufacturing, which means that each worker can contribute more to GDP. So in other words, if you have a factory worker working in a garment factory, for each shirt that they make, they're contributing whatever, 8 cents to GDP. You go to Japan and you have people building robots. Well, for each robot that they build, they're contributing $100,000 to GDP or whatever the number is. And if we look at the differences in population, Japan has a population which is less than 1/10 or about 1/10 that of China. And yet their GDP is about a quarter of China's, which means that each worker is contributing more to the GDP. So China still is at a level of development, a level of manufacturing that they need large numbers of bodies toiling in factories to maintain their GDP level. And they don't have those bodies anymore. Now, when the US hit our aging crisis, or when we should have hit an aging crisis, we didn't have an aging crisis. And the reason why was because of immigration. The US has very high immigration. We allowed last year almost as many people to become citizens in the US as the number of decline in population in China. In other words, we had about 800,000 or 750,000 new citizens last year. Well, they replaced the people who died or the people who retired and left the workforce, and that has kept the US economy strong. China has almost no immigration. In the last 20 years, they've issued something like 1,500 or 2,000 passports to new citizens. So they don't have immigration. They don't have babies. They haven't moved up the value chain. What are they going to do? Now, with the decline of FDI and how that relates is that with the decline of FDI, we also will see a decline in technology transfer. And that will slow China's technological advancement, meaning that it will take them that much longer to reach this high level, high value added manufacturing that could help to compensate for the smaller population. So we have declining FDI, we have an aging crisis. I just want to make sure I've touched on all the points. Tourism, we have decreased tourism and arrivals in China. This is really important. Tourism brings in foreign dollars. brings in dollars, which China needs. Now remember that PBOC keeps about 25% of its reserves in dollars. Actually, though, when you count the amount that's in treasury bills, US dollars, and also US agency bonds, it's actually higher than 25%. But let's say it's 25%. Well, they have to get these dollars someplace. So they can either go on the open market and buy them with yuan, but the value of the yuan is dropping. We have the yuan broke 7, and now I think it's 7.2 yesterday. So it's at a particular low. So it's very expensive for them to go on the open market and buy dollars. So the best way to get dollars then is they can get it through FDI, or they can get it through trade, or they can get it through tourist arrivals. Now, in the first quarter of the year, normally you'd see 3.5 million leisure travelers on package tours, and this year it was 53,000. Right, so normally 3.5 million people would be arriving. Instead, you had 53,000 people arriving. So you don't have the dollars flowing in with tourists. At the same time, the US State Department has issued a traveler's advisory to China. Other governments have done the same. Europe just stepped up their traveler's advisory because of COVID. And this is keeping leisure travelers out of China, but it also means it's getting very difficult to attract foreign talent to China. And the strength of these foreign invested firms, why they're so crucial to the Chinese economy, is that they bring foreign know-how and foreign experts who then pass on their skills to local people. There was when I was working for a Chinese government think tank, I remember there was a quote that was something like, I think it was Li Keqiang who said it, but he said that when China is trying to find an expert, they're drawing from a pool of 1.3 billion. When the US is trying to find an expert, we're drawing from a pool of 7 billion. Basically, the US can draw experts from around the world. And when you go to Silicon Valley, when you go to technology firms, think tanks, you'll see lots and lots of people from South Asia, from East Asia, lots of foreigners working there that are bringing their best skills and knowledge and sharing that with the United States. China has always had trouble attracting foreign talent, but now it's even more extreme than before. Declining agricultural yield is another issue, food security in general. China's agricultural sector has never been as developed as in the US. They actually have, I believe, 75% more people working in agriculture, but producing less total food. The US is a net food exporter. China is a net food importer. Over the last 20 years, China has become richer. People are eating more food, more total food. People are eating more meat, and people are eating more processed food. That means that the import of food has increased. It went from 95% self-sufficiency 20 years ago to 65% self-sufficiency today. As you know, I have a background in the military and security analysis. So in addition to looking at things from an economic standpoint, I often look from a national security defense situation. And of course, there's always the question of what about Taiwan? What if China were to invade Taiwan? What happens then? Well, one of the issues is that China is dependent on food imports from other countries. So if the US and other G7 nations put the same type of sanctions or a block against trade with Taiwan, with China, China would have trouble getting food. They are a net oil importer, net energy importer. They would have trouble getting energy and oil. And this is why the Belt and Road Initiative was so important, particularly the Pakistan corridor, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, which was going to allow China to import energy over land. This is also why the Dragon 2 pipeline, the pipelines from Russia over Mongolia, through Mongolia to China, these are very important because the idea is if China ever had a war with the United States, the US 7th Fleet would halt shipments that are traveling through the Straits of Malacca to China, and that would include oil, possibly food, whatever it is. And this way, if China can bring these things overland, it would make China more independent. It would still be a net importer, but if they could import overland, they'll be going through Russia, Central Asian republics, and so forth, which they might have more influence over or are less likely to engage in a blockade against China. With the food yield, the other problem is that China has less arable land in the United States, and the land itself is less productive. China's so continental China compared to continental United States, China is marginally larger, but the population, of course, is dramatically larger. And only about 25% of China's land mass is even arable farmland. So now Xi Jinping has plans in place to reclaim or to generate farmland. And for me, as an Austrian economist who is generally against government intervention in the economy, this is a classic example of where government intervention is very short-sighted. The reason, if you go anywhere in the world, there's lots of land, but only some of it is being used for farmland. And the reason why is because the most productive land, the most productive farmland is being used as farmland. The less productive farmland is not economically viable and is therefore allocated to other purposes, whatever it is, building houses or office buildings or factories, whatever it is. So we can assume that the land that's already being used as farmland is economically viable, whereas the land that is not being used is not economically viable. And that is the case in China. Some of the land that they're forcing to convert to farmland is only 30% as productive as the existing farmland. And remember that China's existing farmland is not as productive as American farmland. So what does that mean? It is absolutely economically unviable to till that particular soil. So the government is now paying subsidies to farmers. So they're essentially knocking down buildings, public parks, infrastructure, things that already existed and were working and were serving a purpose. They're destroying those to build farms, which are going to be just marginally productive and have to be supported out of government pockets. At the same time, and I find this a bit humorous, China has various green agendas that call for the planting of trees. And like everything else in China, you have a top-down sort of quota system where local governments might have a quota of planting X number of trees. Well, the quota doesn't say that they have to result in more trees existing, just that they have to plant more trees. So in some cases, local governments are cutting down trees to make farmland, and then they're planting trees on the other side of town. So, I mean, this is just more madness. It reminds me of the household responsibility system that was put in right after the around 1977, 1978, when they had these ridiculous policies of melting down existing iron to meet iron production quotas. All right, so that's the farmland issue. Now we have the growth model. So the question is, Xi Jinping, the Communist Party of China, derive their legitimacy from the fact that they raised 800 million people out of poverty. Now, as an economist and as a bit of a critic, I would ask, well, why did you have 800 million people living in poverty to begin with? Nobody else had 8 million people living in poverty at the time that China began their economic rise. However, they raised 800 million people out of poverty. Well, how did they do it? Well, the Chinese economic miracle consisted of a number of elements. And these elements got China from 1980 to about 2010 to have this tremendous economic growth, often double-digit GDP growth, until about 2010, and then it began winding down. And the question is, can China continue to use this model to grow itself out of its current issues? And I say, no, it cannot. And there's a number of reasons why. When China began their economic development, only 20% of the population was urban. Now the number is over 55, 56% that are urban. Why is that important? When you have people in the countryside, let's presume that people in the countryside are working as farmers or working as agricultural workers. Their contribution to GDP is much smaller than when you move them to the city and put them in factories. And just as a back of the envelope explanation of this, I just looked at numbers in the United States. The average agricultural worker earns $2,000 a month. The average factory worker earns $4,000. So again, back of the envelope calculation, for every villager you move from the countryside to the city and you put him in a factory, you've now doubled his or her GDP contribution. Once you get to the cities and you're working in factories, then the next level is you start shifting from there. You get an education, or your children get an education, and they move into the service sector. So now you have, grandfather was a grandfather was a farmer contributing $2,000 to GDP. The father is a factory worker contributing 4,000. The son or daughter becomes a lawyer or accountant and contributes 8,000. So we have this tremendous increase in GDP as you shift people from the rural areas to the urban areas. Now, of course, those numbers were numbers for the US. For China, those numbers would all be smaller, but the ratios would be similar to what I'm saying. Today, you've got fewer people living in the countryside. So if we moved them all to the city tomorrow, we would not see the same type of jump. That's number one. Number two, just like my argument about the best farmland was already allocated towards farm usage, the best countryside people were already moved to the country. It's just like the arguments about why the United States developed so quickly when we did. And we said, well, we had immigration, and the best and the brightest of Europe, the people who had the good ideas but couldn't make them work in Europe because of a class system, they came to America and jumped our GDP. And that's the same thing with China. The person that was in the countryside, that was hardworking, that was intelligent, that was trainable, well, they already moved to the city. So that's part of the problem. And of course, if we look at age demographics, we'll see that there's a lot more old people in the countryside than there are in the cities. And that's another issue. Moving those old people to the city won't necessarily increase the GDP by very much, if any. The other issue is that we have about 250 million migrant workers in China. So these are people who are officially registered as living in the countryside, but because of their hukou number, they can't move to Beijing or Shanghai or move to a large city. They're not allowed to. However, they go there and they work as migrant workers. So what that really means is these people, the contribution that these people would make to GDP in the city is already figured in. It's already added to the factory activity that's going on. Physically moving these people to the cities and making them live in apartments wouldn't necessarily add anything to GDP. So continued urbanization is not going to add very much. Now, something else China did to grow their economy was that they built infrastructure. When you did not have a train from Shanghai to Beijing, building a train from Shanghai to Beijing probably tremendously jumped the GDP. And then after you built a train from Shanghai to Beijing, then you said, well, I'll build a train from Shanghai to the next largest city and the next largest city, and then connecting the 18th largest city with the 20th largest city and so forth, and going all the way down the value chain. And then you reach a point where building the next train to connect the 1,579th largest city with its counterpart doesn't necessarily add very much to GDP. Now, China had a breakthrough in technology, and they said, oh, you know what we'll do? We'll now go and add high-speed rail. Okay, great. So you added high-speed rail from Shanghai to Beijing. You got a bit of a jump of GDP. But remember, high-speed rail is very expensive. And then the jump in GDP was very small. And of course, declining as we moved from Shanghai to Beijing, as opposed to the 5,000th largest city with the 501st largest city. So we're at a point where what I would call the sensible infrastructure has largely been built, and that additional infrastructure projects would increase the debt of the country, which already stands at 300% of GDP. So you'd be financing this with debt. It would create what we call, Austrian economists call, illusory growth, meaning that if you borrow money and you build infrastructure, roads to nowhere, houses that nobody lives in, yes, it generates economic activity in the short run. It creates jobs in the short run. It pumps up the GDP in the short run. But that is the boom. And then the bust will come and the debt has to be paid. Right now in China, you have tremendous oversupply. You have 50 million, I believe, unsold apartments. I think, I can't remember the number exactly, if it's 15 million square meters of unrented business office parks and so forth. So we have all this unrented, unused office space. We have the unsold apartments, and we have very expensive real estate prices, and young people can't afford to buy apartments. So then the question is, why does this not just adjust? In a market economy, you can't have unsold apartments on the market that nobody buys because the price is too high. That doesn't happen. The price will come down to meet the demand, or the owners will withdraw those houses from from the market, which is what will happen in the US. If we had rent control tomorrow and suddenly the government said all rents have to be $500, well, then people who normally rent apartments would stop renting them. They'd come off the market. So why hasn't this happened in China? Why hasn't the market adjusted? And the answer is there are government price controls that are preventing the price of real estate from coming down. And if they did allow the price to be dictated by the market, the price of these apartments would plummet. These apartments right now are being used as collateral against loans in the construction industry. Now, we know that Evergrande declared bankruptcy. We know that they're now looking for restructuring of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of debt. In total, I believe the real estate debt is something like $8 trillion, and that is being secured by apartments. And that only works if the value of the apartments on paper remains high enough to secure the loans. And this is basically, if you're familiar with the SVB Bank, Silicon Valley Bank that failed a few months ago in the United States, basically what happened was the assets on paper were valued at a rate higher than what their market value was if they sold them tomorrow. And it turned out that there was a 20% discrepancy, and that was enough to cause the bank to collapse. Well, with this real estate, all we need is about a 30% decrease in the price of property for the entire industry to collapse. So that's one reason why Beijing is not allowing the market to clear out this problem. The other issue is that most of private household wealth, about 2/3, is tied up in real estate. These families have their life savings, generational life savings tied up in real estate. If tomorrow that real estate lost 30% of its value, these families would feel like they had been wiped out economically. So if Beijing is not going to allow the market to correct this problem, what will they do? Well, real estate accounts for 30% of the economy, and it may be more. I always claim that it's more if we count indirect services and workers that are selling supplies and services to the real estate sector. They can't allow it to collapse, so they will have to continue to lend money to the sector. But meanwhile, we now have debt at 300% of GDP, and the debt just keeps growing. So can this go on forever? I just don't see how it can. You're building empty apartments next to other empty apartments while you're facing a real estate crisis, and then you're going to solve this problem by building more empty apartments next to other empty apartments. Just going to take a look here. Oh, the other thing China did during their economic miracle was that they encouraged FDI. They opened up the free trade zones first, in Shenzhen and elsewhere, and then they encouraged FDI. Well, right now FDI is leaving China. FDI is down. And so much of FDI depends on perception. So much of any type of investment depends on perception, and then people's feelings, forecasts about the future. Right now, the risk of investing in China is very high. The economic risk is high, and the political risk is high. The counter-espionage law, the international relations law, and other legislation by Xi Jinping has made it very difficult to operate in China. That normal business activities such as due diligence, such as auditing, such as even market research could be construed as prying into sensitive topics, which is now illegal. And we have seen business consulting companies being raided and people being arrested or detained because they had asked questions about allegedly sensitive topics. Well, if that's the situation, how can we possibly open a company? How could you invest in a joint venture if you're not even allowed to audit the books of the company that you're investing in or that you're partnering with? Then we have the sanctions from abroad, which are tightening and increasing. And what if you invest in a joint venture in China and it turns out that your joint venture partner has a manufacturing activity in Xinjiang and is now subject to sanctions, and you are subject to secondary sanctions? So the risk of investing in China is increasing. At the same time, there is a movement towards patriotism and support of local brands, which is causing foreign brands to decline. A lot of Korean brands have pulled out of China now. Even Nike, which used to earn a tremendous amount of money. They used to be #1 in China. They are no longer #1. I believe Flybuy or one of the Chinese brands. When I went to the sports university, I remember it was a big deal who had Nike wrestling shoes and who had the Chinese ones. And now the Chinese brand has actually overtaken Nike. And I don't know that they're any better now than they were then. I think it's just part of a patriotic movement. But the point is, why would you invest and to sell your foreign product in China if every day there's propaganda telling people not to buy foreign products? So basically, the outlook for foreign companies in China is that they will have greater risk and lower return. But at the same time, we know that there is this movement to de-risk and to shift manufacturing to, for example, Vietnam. The United States just signed an agreement with Vietnam, which increases the relationship between the United States and Vietnam to a strategic partnership. This will encourage investment in Vietnam. And if you're a company that wanted to operate in China, or you were operating in China, you may now shift that investment over to Vietnam. There may be tax incentives, there may be loan incentives, and there would be lower political risk, and there will be all sorts of advantages. And as the manufacturing shifts to either Indonesia or India or Vietnam, then we begin to have economies of scale. Then the infrastructure starts to come and improve. The logistics begin to improve, because right now China has excellent ports, they have excellent logistics. Then that's one of the things that has kept companies in China in spite of all the other problems. But all these things can be built. They didn't fall out of the sky. They were built over time. They were built through companies moving there, setting up, and creating opportunities for other companies to create logistics and the supply chain and so forth. So
Antonio, sorry.
Yes, sir.
Just wanted to interrupt you there. I know you've got a few more things to say, but I have a couple of questions here on what you've talked about previously. You mentioned that there were 250 million migrant workers in China. Is that an accurate number?
That's correct, yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously it's an estimate. We don't know the exact number, but you'll see figures anywhere from 220 to something like 270 million.
Where do all those people come from?
They come from the countryside. These are countryside people. They're Chinese. They're not migrants in the sense of like North Koreans or something crossing the border.
Oh, okay. So they're migrant workers who are allowed to live in the cities and work in the cities, but they're not officially allowed to be resident there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes, but I would hesitate to use the word allowed. I would say that a blind eye is turned, because given their hukou numbers, they're not really allowed. As you said, they're not allowed to live there. And I think that, I think they just sort of turn a blind eye, but they go there and they work in the factories. And a lot of what we know about the decline in factory activity comes from those guys, because they tend to be more vocal and willing to talk to journalists. So there are journalists on the ground in China that'll ask them, think about the cost of a train ticket, and that these people are relatively poor, and then they put money together, they get on a train, they go all the way to Shenzhen, or they go wherever, and they get there and they find out that the factory is not hiring, or it's only hiring part-time or half-time or something like this, reduced hours. And these people are pretty vocal about it. It's like, I uprooted my life, I spent all this money, and now I'm not earning anything. So what we know from them is that factory activity is down, hours worked in the factories are down, number of workers chosen is down. And which when we see the factory activity down, then we know that exports will be down.
Okay. So you've given a lot of bad news there. Do you see anything good? Any possibilities for change or growth?
For Xi Jinping to change the trajectory of China, he would have to change the system. If they would tomorrow just pull all the government controls out and have an open economy, that would probably solve a lot of these problems. I mean, not overnight, but housing prices would plummet, but then people would be able to buy houses, and they would be happy about that, and people would start to get back to work. But right now, one of the issues is that we have too much government control. The other one is that the world opinion of China is souring. So if people are unhappy with China, they're less willing to invest in China. They don't want to work there. They're less likely to invest in China. And because the G7 is now more or less in agreement that we're going to be de-risking. It means that all the countries are going to be creating other opportunities for their companies other than China. So I guess the good news that I would say, if there is a good news for China, I would say the good news is that I don't believe China will collapse. I mean, China is just so huge and they have so much manufacturing, they have so much capacity, they have so much going on. Even with these declines, it's still tremendous. It's just that they will not, they have a 2050 goal to overtake the US by 2050. To do that, they have to have growth in excess of 3% every year. And again, I'm doing a back of the envelope calculation that when China's economy grows by about 3%, that's the same number of dollars as the US economy growing by about 2%. So they have to get more growth than us. So to get more than 3% to pass us by 2050. So I think that they have to adjust their expectations. They're not going to overtake the US by 2050. They may never overtake us. But the good news is it's not going to collapse. They're not all going to become poor. Everybody's not going to starve to death. They're just going to be on a more natural growth from here on out.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to give some time to our other presenter here, Ben, to be able to present something, but we have some good questions and we're going to get to those at the end of the presentation and we'll bring you back on for that. So I wanted to now introduce Ben Lai, who is the president of the China-US Business Association. The China-US Business Association is a 100% US business founded in 2005. It's a for-profit corporation and a non-governmental organization. So they do a lot of work in terms of cultural and social activities to promote relationships with China. And this NGO is dedicated to foster relationships between domestic and international business interests. So he's been working to build bridges between countries, promote diversity and cultural exchange for many years. So I'd like to invite Ben to unmute and share your thoughts on this situation in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Dr. Antonio. All the introduction and about the China, actually very important. I think he gave a lot of inside out all about the China. But what we relate to the China and why the China rise a giant economic power in the world? Actually, I was born and raised in Taiwan. We share the same language, same culture, understanding history. So we know a lot of things about China. So I was born and raised in Taiwan and I came to the United States. In 1985, I was the Chinese American Association president. We have 5,500 high-tech family in here. I established first Chinese school. I told everyone, Chinese language will be second most important language in the world beside English, because I know that. I was 20 years old. I've been traveling 15 countries already. And then I said something going to happen. Three things going to happen. One, China going to rise a giant economic power in the world. Everyone was laughing because they was making $8 a month. We was making $3,000 a month in 1985. And no one believed it. I said, okay, don't believe it. Number two, China, US going to come for each other, fight each other, because I know that. I know the culture, everything. And number third, all China have a big China circle going to form one Belt, One Road, and against another group. Because I know the cultural history about the China. I'm from Taiwan. And why I tell you why I predict the China will rise to giant coast. China have 1.4 billion population, have a big population benefits in it. There's no any other country in the world has such a manpower. And number two, the culture and the background of people search for reach and freedom. Number third, they are very smart in number, just like Jewish, very good in number. Number four, they are very diligent. They can work 365 days a year. There's no other country can do it. They can work 10, 11, 12, even 20 hours a day. This is the Chinese people. So I predict they will rise a giant. So why the last 30, 20, 30 years, how China become a superpower in the world, second largest power in the world, depends on two things, very simple, two things. One, trade. They have a lot of manpower. So people buy merchandise and ship it out. They make tons of money, trillions of dollars. they grow like 10%, 80% GDP. Why? They export, making a lot of money into the number one. Number two, who moved this economic power? Another sector is investment. The people know, oh yeah, you build a factory because you can invest money and you can have a double, triple, 10 times size. All the world, all the money flood into China. So last 20, 30 years, I think China enjoyed what happened for the economic power in the world. But 2020, something happened. COVID-19 started. This is what hurt China and hurt the world. When COVID started, the United States, I was in California. 1.5 year, I remember, until 2021, June, no one allowed to go out. There's no business, nothing, everything stopped. China faced the same thing too. They are worse than us. Until a few months ago, they locked them down 3 months, and then they didn't go again for 2 months, and then locked them down again. What have been locked them down? That allowed to go out of the house, even about the apartment. So who can go to work? No one can go to work. So what happened? This one killed all the business. No one spent money. Factory cannot get any order to ship out, right? That's number one. And number two, due to the last 3.5 years, we have war between the Russia and Ukraine. Everything economy slowed down and tense now. The focus all in this North region. So everyone's scared what happened. And because COVID-19 and war, plus number third, the last 3.5 years, all the natural disasters, earthquake, flood, hurricane, all happened in China and over the world. Economy starts slow down. Now what? What happened is one trade stopped. Investment disappeared. Then whole China, all the engine stopped. The people no job, they lost a job. The company closed. And then, just for example, investment, just like Dr. Antonio said, the tourists go to, you know how the tourists goes to down there? 2019, the first 3 months, January and March, the 3.72 million visits to China. Like us, I bring a lot of business into China. What? Investment. Where to go to see China? What kind of business opportunity? Everything. If nobody into China, there's no investment. You know how many people that during the 4 January and March, the 3 months, 52,000 people visit China only. It's lost 98%. 98% the people into China. What could happen? If you don't go to China, how to say, I'm going to invest money in China, and you don't know anything, you put the money, great risk. Correct? So export stop. And then investment disappear. What caused problem? Export, I give you a very good idea. All supply chain broken. Okay. Each company relied on many parts to come to one company assembly. If A, B, C couldn't supply parts, number C cannot finish product. So all the canceled by the United States, Europe. Why? If I press order, say, hey, can I get my order June? They say, oh yeah, I can do it. And then 6 months later, still cannot deliver it. 8 months later, cannot deliver, I'll cancel your order. All the trade stop. Now later, all the people, where they get the money? The worker. There's no money. I give you an example. Last year, a container steel shipped out from China to the United States is $13,000 per container. You know how much now? There's no container shipped out to China. It's $900 per container. Begging for the container, merchandise ship out. $900. What that mean? Everything stopped now. Investment disappear. Company lost job, lost order, everything. When the job lost, who had the money to spend? No one spent, right? And the biggest Chinese during the time, a lot of people invest money into China. retirement benefit, fund everything go into China, everything stop now. No one invests because they don't make money. Because the A stock, the nice stock, dropped the history low. Now it's a housing, just like Dr. Antonio said.
So Ben, I
They were
think
shocked.
we'll bring Antonio back on and we can have a little discussion here.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, the most important, the housing bubble is it's about 20 to 25 GDP the whole nation. Everybody invests money into the housing. And they believe the house price never drop, always increase. Just like in 2008, it was, oh yeah, house is gonna, when you have to reach some, you don't have money to buy, to pay, the monthly payment, mortgage, you're in trouble. The biggest crash first one is by Evergrande, $2.4 trillion RMB. The size never happened in history on Earth. Country Garden, second one, $1.75 trillion.
Yes, these are huge amounts.
Zhongzhuan, this government supplied the financial institute 3.4 trillion. You know what that means? 3.4 trillion RMB, humongous size. They have 58 companies, all in deep trouble now.
So I have a question for both of you here. Okay, with all of the bad news that you've given, is it actually a good thing for the world and for the US, or is this bad for the US and the rest of the world?
It's bad for the world.
Okay.
Sorry.
Ben, you go first and then Antonio, give him a chance.
Why? Due to the best time, every country invests all the money and making money from inside to China, from investment. Wall Street, everyone's making money. But now, all the bankruptcy, they can pay the debt, they can pay everything. They are in big trouble now. Number two, if they don't have pay the money, the bankruptcy, all financial institutions got in trouble.
Okay.
Banking, everyone got in trouble. Okay.
Antonio, what's your thoughts on this?
So my thought is that it is good for the rest of the world and for the United States.
Okay.
And I know that sometimes that's an unpopular opinion, but I'll explain myself. A lot of people look at the business that we do with China, the trade that we do with China, and they say, well, if China were to collapse or if we decoupled with China, all that trade would disappear. Well, no, absolutely not. The demand of the United States would remain the same. You and I would still want to buy, iPods and I don't know, slippers. I don't know what people buy. You would still want to buy things, the same quantity of things, right? So someone would sell them to you. It just wouldn't be China. So those companies would relocate to India, Vietnam, whatever. Probably we would see a general increase in prices, but it would not be astronomical. And ultimately, we would then decouple from China. So yeah, I think it's good for the rest of the world. Because could you imagine if Vietnam absorbed 10% of the manufacturing from China? Could you imagine what that would do for the people of Vietnam? You talk about lifting people out of poverty.
That's an interesting point. And I think even places like Africa are starting to build their economic capacity, and some of that business may start going to countries, like Nigeria, which has 240 million people, young people who are willing to work. Okay, Ben, what were you going to say?
2018, the World Economic Conference in China. They asked me to invite the leader from global. I invited Mexico president, former president, President Fox, ex-President Fox, and First Lady Marsha to China World Conference. And I told every business, about 5,000 businesses, if you don't follow me, you're going to miss. Something going to happen. So China for the last 20, 30 years is the biggest number one trade partner with the United States. What about this number? Begin the numbers this year. Who is the biggest trade partner with the United States? It's not China anymore, called Mexico. How much? $263 billion you can check. I already know something's going to happen.
Wow, that's quite
it's not anymore.
Okay, I'm going to turn my question around now. Okay, is it a good thing for China or a bad thing for China? that there's a decline? Because
That's
people would want to have a little pain there in China to perhaps promote some social political reform. So I'm going to start with Antonio first here. What do you think?
Obviously, in the short run, it would be a bad thing for China. The initial effects would be bad for China and for the average citizen. However, if Beijing would ease up and allow social freedoms and allow economic and market freedom in the long run, it would be dramatically better for the people. They would have more social freedom. We know that the market makes people richer, the market economy versus social economy. And the people would get richer. They'd be able to afford those apartments. Think about that. Think about how many young people, when I was at the sports university or my students or whatever, like, they're getting married, they can't afford to buy a house. And meanwhile, there's 1,000 houses in their neighborhood that are unsold and have been for 10 years. Could you imagine if, they allowed the price to come down, those married couples could move into a house, they'd be happy. So I think in the long run, it would be better for China.
Okay.
Dr. Antonio is right. Dr. Antonio is right, because this year, total graduate from college is 11.5 million young people. Few months ago, we know about 21% unemployment. Actually, much higher, maybe double, because all factory closed, right? And nobody had money to spend it. And I want to point out, their biggest benefit for the population disappeared. About 20 years ago, the birth rate is 26, 27 million baby a year. Do you know next year how many baby they born in China? When you're pregnant 3 months, you have to register. Guess. Not the half, not 30 million, not 10 million. It's 8 million only. From 26 to 27 to 8 million, they're in big trouble now. I have a number, 8 million, because they have registered pregnancy for delivery. 8 million registered, because they cannot afford the house, they can afford the baby.
So I know that
a big one.
The Chinese government is trying to promote more babies and promote them having. Why don't they want to have babies over there?
Okay, very simple. It's just like 1990 Japan. You're going to have baby? No one dare to have baby. They're scared to death. Just if my kid said, I cannot afford have a baby, I cannot survive, how can I have my baby suffering? So Japan have something that's dropped. They had no birth rate, like a 0 point something. China faced the same thing too. From 26, 27 million a year to now next year will be 8 million. You know how scary? From 26, 28 to 8 million population baby, and the Asian.
So you think it's more of they don't see hope in the future that things are going to grow. Would you agree?
They try, but very difficult. Unless the young people are comfortable, I make money, I enjoy, I'll have baby. 2 or 3.
Right.
No, they don't. They're scared to death.
Antonio, do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I totally agree with Ben. And about the babies, the irony of Chinese communism versus when we had Eastern European communism. I used to work in East Germany right after the reunification, and Eastern European communism, you had a good school system, you had a really good education system, you had socialized medicine, you had these safety nets, and they were good enough. Now in China, theoretically, school is free, but parents wind up paying incredible amounts of money for tuition, which I don't know, in America we'd call that tutoring or something, where they go to these bushy bonds and things at night and they study. So having a baby, and they use private hospitals because you don't want to take your family to the free state hospital. So having a baby in China is incredibly expensive. Just the education in a country with free education, the education still costs 1/3 of the average family's income. So it's only made possible. So much of the Chinese economy is only made possible by the fact that you have one kid with 2 parents and 4 grandparents, and they all put their money into one kid. So this is an absolutely unsustainable system. And if it's 1/3 of your income for the education of one kid, how can you possibly have a second kid? You can't put 60% of your income into that.
Right.
So the China government, what they did one thing in 2021 or 22, 2021, I believe, the China government decided not have a private education, private school, private institute. all shut down. You know how many people lost job during the time? 22 million people in the educated industry lost job. 22 million.
Yeah.
All shut down. Private sector.
I want to get to a couple of questions from our audience. Okay. So I'm going to go back to one from Dale at the beginning, and you touched on this a little bit, but the Belt and Road Initiative. It was designed to kind of bring substantial economic benefit to China and other countries by increasing trade. However, China is widely seen as having used that initiative as a debt trap for countries like Sri Lanka. And I know even recently, Italy announced that they were trying to pull out of any relationships with China and the BRI. So this has kind of created a sense of distrust internationally. Antonio, would you like to comment a little bit about this?
Sure. The Belt and Road basically promised that if these countries joined the Belt and Road and China would loan the money and they would build infrastructure, it promised that it would increase their GDP and they would be able to pay off the loans out of the increase in the GDP. Well, most of these countries have not seen their GDP increase. A lot of the projects were not finished, and a lot of them are just terrible. If you go to, Cambodia, some of the countries where I go, or I haven't been to Africa, but apparently it's the same situation. But you have, housing blocks that they built that are crumbling. You have roads that are breaking, bridges that are collapsing. And meanwhile, the countries still have to pay their loans back. It's not like when you buy something on Amazon and you say, "Oh, it's broken, I want my money back." So they still have to pay back the loan. And the other issue with these loans was that the loans required the use of construction companies from China. Very often, it didn't even create low-level jobs. Even workers with shovels and picks were flown from China to countries that have 30% unemployment, and then they're flying in Chinese workers to do low-level jobs. So these countries did not see a benefit from the Belt and Road, most of them.
Ben, any comments on that?
Not only that, I was 1985, I predict the third thing going to happen is China going to have a big China circle. It's one belt, one road. When you do this one, what could happen is they forgive the loan to Africa and many countries. Now, the World Bank not going to give a loan to the China for underdeveloped country. But once they take the benefit for us, a developing country, all the benefits disappear. China can face another challenge in economic power because you can forgive some other countries the loan, right? At debt. You're not the developing country. You're a developed country already. Why give you all the benefit for you, China? So they're going to face another big challenge again. Not only people don't like the China because, hey, you didn't finish and pay, and everyone have all kinds of things about China. But worse is coming back to China again.
So we'd like to kind of wrap up the formal portion of our program today. So Ben, I'd like you to give a couple of words, just in 1 minute. What do you think is the likely future for China over the next, say, 3 years?
I think China is going to face a great challenge for the financial crisis, including people inside not going to satisfy for the government, mainly because they don't have job, they lost job, everything. So economic not going to recover within the next few 5, 7, 8 years, take longer. But overall, China still have a potential. If they have a right system, everything changing, they still have power. Because 5 to 40 million people pretty rich in China. Number, percentage low, but 40 million, about higher. 5 million, very rich.
Thank you. And Antonio, some closing comments?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Ben. I don't see China collapsing. I just see China slowing down tremendously. If this will bring about social change or not, I don't know. I mean, that would just be projecting, right? We don't know. I mean, there's sort of a theory that there's this unwritten contract between the CCP and the people that if the people cede their freedom, and then the CCP will help them get rich. And now the CCP has broken that agreement. So the government's going to change. I don't know that I see that happening, but I definitely see China just sort of normalizing, stabilizing, not becoming the next world power.
Great. Thank you very much. So Just to conclude the public portion of our program here, I wanted to invite everybody to sign up for our newsletter. You can access that on our UPF website at us.upf.org, or you can sign up through the email that you received. There's a link at the bottom of the email as well if you haven't done so already. And if you're watching this on YouTube, we invite you to join us for another program. We do the economic portion of this program every Tuesday on the third Tuesday of each month, but we have webinars from UPF every Tuesday from different associations. So thank you. And if you're wanting to stay around, we will open up for discussion.